Good evening, Hobo Cadets. Um, I almost forgot to do this, in fact. But today is our second discussion of class. Uh, and today we're going to talk about what class is by its original definition. And so last time we talked about sort of what the average person is talking about, what they're talking about when they say class on TV, and when they generally, when the layman speaks of economics and class. You can take a look at my last video on class to take a look at that. But spoilers, basically it focuses on income. It takes no account of property ownership and or very little account, and mostly, not mostly, it focuses on income, and it completely ignores, for instance, the regulator. So let's start again. So the word class, right? I said last time it's short for classification, right? But that's kind of a modern, definition, let's say. Sorry, keep wiggling the camera. Definition. Okay, so class, the word comes from Latin. Okay, it comes from classarius. And classarius was a horseman. So, a knight. Because in military, in the military, when you have an organized military, you have to separate the types of soldiers that you have. For instance, especially in ancient military, you'd have, skirmishers, cavalry, ranged, bow and arrow or spear or something. So there was a group called the classarius, and the horsemen are historically usually renowned figures. Why? Because, well, two reasons. They are very important on a battlefield, very decisive, and if you owned your own horse, that made you a decisive person. So that's kind of where the idea of knights came from. If you were to go farther back than chevaliers and look for where the word knight, sort of the same way you look at classarius, and it actually comes from Latin. If you go to the New York Public Library and go through those old books, and I did. Anyway, so essentially, we're going to start with this, right? So essentially, the entire idea of this is like, okay, so it's like they're selling it to you that you're a knight. You're important, and that's why the government is classifying you. Does that make sense? It's kind of, yeah, it seems to me like a sales tactic, because there's a classification for the knights, right? There's a class of knights, and not everyone classified gets to be a knight. So the fact that originally everyone was supposed to feel like they were a knight, even for being a peasant, that's an interesting thought. Because now the idea of just being a class, being any class, being some nobility, being some compliment from the public or the state, is kind of a joke nowadays. But in Rome, at one point or another, at least they were selling it as this nobility, right? And so what is nobility? Nobility is the highest class. So we're going to start from the top here, because you'll see why it makes sense. Top class, historically, is the government. Why? Because they define class. You see that? They regulate class. You see? So, sovereignty, executive. So you can see where this is going. So these people kind of end up deciding what other people, or that's what they're classified as doing. They decide what's valuable. Okay, so you can see how that's the top class in the original scheme of things, you know. So, and they collect taxes. So they collect taxes and define wealth. So by definition, they cannot run out of money. They've already beaten the game. It's like the bank at Monopoly, even without the bank. Because if you have the guns, then you decide which bank is allowed. So they have a monopoly on force. And we'll talk about why later, because that's kind of a trick in itself. Right there, that's a trick in itself, because you can't have a monopoly on force. That's why force is necessary, and that's why force ends up being decisive. Because having a monopoly on force is a complete impossibility, which is why all this mind control is necessary. It's why you need to call people knights when you're relegating them and get them to relegate themselves and say like, oh, I'm so proud I relegated myself. So let's continue. So the top class actually streams down into the other classes, right? Because the king or the sovereign can't regulate it himself. He can't follow through with enforcing the regulations himself. So he needs other people of the lower classes to do this for him, and that is why he gets to call them classarius. That's why he has to say, oh, you're knights, you're actually doing this for your own good. And there are instances where it can be for your own good, especially when you're at war or someone's at war with you, for instance. You don't even have to be consider yourself at war. Someone could just be at war with you. It does make sense to pay attention to who does what and what's going on, and designate spots. They can designate people, things like that. That makes sense in a wartime scenario. So they sort of engineer society to be always in a wartime scenario, okay, so that they can regulate it, so they can collect taxes and have borders and so on. So then we get to the middle class. Who's the middle class? It's property owners. And so the 1% would be here, and this, since right now, I'll clean the lens. Let me see. Maybe that does make it a little better. So you can see more what I'm doing now. So the 1% mostly would be here. And I advise you to think about the fact that there's 7 billion people on Earth, right? So that means 1% of 7 billion people on Earth, that's 70 million. Do you understand? That's your 1%. Do you think that there's an Illuminati conspiracy involving 70 million people? Because sort of, but there isn't. They're not all drinking blood or some madness, like. So when you say the 1%, you're like, oh, and you like just. I'm not saying not to mention 1% if you're trying to talk about 1%. I'm saying that to act like you know what's going through 70 million people's minds, or act like 70 million people all got to something by the same means, or that by any means is a small, exclusive group of people, is, well, it's hilarious. And obviously, the more you go up the percents, the more it becomes hilarious. But most people use 1%, and I was part of Occupy Wall Street, so I remember that a lot. And here you have it. So the property owners, so what's a property owner? A property owner is, and I have to be completely 100% with you guys, right? It's anyone that can be held responsible for their identity, right? Your identity is property, so responsible folk. Someone you can trust that their ID is accurate, someone you can trust not to commit crimes, and these people end up setting boundaries for themselves. They create boundaries and they end up with property, and they end up, well, not just that, they end up making deals with others, saving their income and buying property, right? So these people buy property, own property. And that's actually, this is the actual, really, the thing that makes you middle class by the original idea of class. And what property you own would define what class you were in the middle, right? But in Western society, at least let's say 50 years ago, it was well known that the middle class is property owners. You could just own a house. But that's the thing. So now most of the Western world has property taxes, which is essentially like paying rent to the sovereign, to the state, right? So most property is businesses nowadays. Yeah, I can't spell for anything, okay, but it don't matter. Nothing matters. Carl is here with us all the time. Anyway. What am I saying? So most middle class people, most people that are able to stay above inflation and avoid poverty in the Western world nowadays are business owners, because that's the only real property you're able to own that isn't constantly sinking due to inflation. Not due to inflation, due to property taxes, is actually growing due to inflation. And that's really why they do property taxes. Because so they have it set up so if you own property, they keep printing money because they don't actually succeed through capitalism and through let's say, being productive. They succeed by printing money and claiming to be productive and claiming to represent the collective, the whole state, the whole government, to represent, to basically be able to decide what's valuable for other people. And to be that valuable, you see. So they keep printing money so that they can keep saying that they're rich, but that money, they can't actually make it valuable because there's a science that they can't change. So they end up making the property more valuable. So they've had to basically make it illegal to actually own property, and they've had to make it in much of the Western world, for instance in the United States, which is supposedly the most capitalist country on earth. You basically can't own property. You have to continuously pay these property taxes, and it's to the point where if you don't own a business, you can't expect to be living unsupported in your own home into your old age, and they don't think about it. They don't notice it. More or less, it's like the media has simply acted as though it's normal, but it's the most abnormal thing in the world. And people here are constantly complaining about capitalism. It's like, well, you're not allowed to own property. You're not even allowed to be middle class. 9 out of 10, you have to own a business that's making that's making more profit than property taxes to stay above water. And then at the bottom of the original class system is people without property. Okay? I'm going to put that in quotes because we're going to have to talk about that. In fact, maybe I'll talk about it by the end of the video today. So what am I saying? So these people in the olden times had no last names. So they were harder to hold responsible. So they weren't considered to own themselves. They don't own themselves. They have no property. Owning yourself would be property. Do you understand? So when you claim to be of, the poverty-stricken class, remember, this all comes from feudalism, where people were born into classes. That's how the world was for thousands of years. Almost every culture on earth. Like even if you were in a tribe, if your parents were the high priest, you were expected to be a high priest. Even in the most fantasy, I'm not saying there aren't exceptions. I'm saying that's how most of the universe, how most of the world as we know it, has been for thousands and thousands of years. That there was someone in charge, obviously, and the person in charge, well, not obviously, but obviously the person in charge decides what is valuable to the group, decides what is good for the group to do and bad for the group to do. And the people doing it of the lower classes kind of represent the guy in charge. So they kind of, in the loopholes, can do whatever they want. So they're kind of in the top class as well. Police officers and so on. Government bureaucrats. People paid by the state to enforce their initiatives. And given leeway by the state to enforce their initiatives. Over here are the people who are minding their own business, but through some luck and responsibility. And keep in mind, it's not just the 1%, okay? It's everybody who owns property. You can own a little house, and you can own a car, you can own your own body, own your own identity. You're actually in the middle class by some means. But it's things that they can tax. That's what the middle class is. And these are people that they don't really have any respect for and who live on other people's property. And so because they aren't considered to have anything to put down, they put themselves down, they get into debt, and they become slaves. And that's where slaves used to come from. Slaves were peasants. And what we call slaves today used to come from the chattel slaves, would come from if you invaded someone else and you took their soldiers and peasants as your property, and since they were foreign, they didn't have rights in your land, they were chattel slaves. But the average slave was a peasant, and the average person was a slave. They had no rights because they had no property, because you couldn't hold them responsible. They were people who lived on the land of the landowner, right? And the landowner would have what was considered a private relationship with them, and he kind of respected them, but only as people who lived on his land, sort of like lice lives on your dog. If your dog respected the lice, it's terrible. But then exactly, and you can see where communism comes from. It comes from a critique of feudalism, and that's why. Where did it take hold? Where does it take hold? In places where this is relevant, in places where they think in very old conservative ways, old world ways, where there's a king, there's a right way of thinking and a wrong way of thinking. You're not really allowed to have certain values, and there's strong regulation about what's allowed, what's valuable, and some people are considered responsible, and some people are not held responsible at all. And it's all part of this society, you see. There isn't a war between these two groups. It doesn't make any sense, because this group defines itself by that group, and this group defines itself by that group. The war is on this group. the people in the middle, the people who don't work for the government and who take responsibility for themselves, who don't give responsibility for themselves to either property owners or the government. These people end up getting screwed. These people end up getting screwed, but these people have less to lose and often see gain in screwing these people, often for either their own sovereigns, their own states, or foreign states. And that's often how you conquer a nation. And that's what they use, for instance, Marxism for. And that's why, for instance, every time a communist nation, a communist philosophy takes over a nation, it always ends in despotism, it always ends in a dictatorship. That's because this is actually the mechanism they're using. They make you think that these people can kind of eat this and become this. And really, this is already supported by this. So this is already sort of this. So all they're kind of doing is disassembling their own civilization in ways that these people like, and on behalf of these people, foreign or domestic, right? When they're following through with these political philosophies in context, which they never make sense in context, which is why I always have to say in context. Or should I say they never make sense in full context. So they cherry pick context to try to make them make sense. And we can go through the different contexts later. But today I just wanted to talk to you about how class exists. So in ancient times it was kings and priests, and then soldiers and craftsmen and businessmen, and then peasants, right? And then afterwards it just became government and regulators, property owners, and people without property. And really these don't exist anymore, because since we outlawed slavery and you're considered an owner of your own property, you're an owner of your own identity, which is why you can, for instance, be held accountable for the law and still be put in prison, yeah, that exists. That's what that is. So these people kind of don't exist anymore. This is kind of an illusion, even in this whole philosophy. And this philosophy is based on right of God, right? Which is just, like I'm saying, these people deciding what's valuable because they're right, because they represent God, or the social contract, which is essentially the same thing, but replace God with the collective. And yeah, so these, in a sense, this represents everybody in America, because you're not allowed to own property. But in a sense, it represents nobody in the modern world, because everybody is considered an owner of their own identity, regardless of how corporatist, bureaucratic, and statist that has become. The modern philosophy has broken the state, and we will talk about the political science of how that works. But they're trying to bring back the idea that your class is by blood, and we broke that idea, and it's never coming back. But they're basically using the people who are in a certain amount of poverty through education and such, that believe that the state was naturally by blood, as a club to the people that do things, and the people who want to use this responsibly. But all of this is mind control. Thank you for your time. Have a good evening.